Raymond, I'm an associate professor here at NFREC Quincy and vegetable specialist. And so it's my pleasure today. This is in conjunction leading up to our 100th anniversary celebration, which will be next Friday. We've gone through, most of you have been with us. We've gone through a series of speakers looking at the past, present, and next week we'll be looking at the future of NFREC. But this week we have the great privilege of having a speaker that's going to kind of inform all of us about the history of agriculture in Gadsden County. And so with us today, we've got Mr. Bobby Durden. And Bobby is a retired extension agent, retired county director for Gadsden County, where he served 34 years with IFAS Cooperative Extension, and 17 of those in Gadsden County. He was also an extension agent in Wakulla and Leon, and he spent time on the Gadsden Soil Water Conservation District, and he's currently a co-owner and operator of Durden Red Angus here in Gadsden County. And he serves on the board of directors for the Gadsden Cattlemen's Association, and was also a founding member of the Shade Tobacco Museum in Havana, Florida. So it is, we greatly appreciate Bobby coming to do this. I mean, he's got a wealth of knowledge, and certainly it'll be something that we wanted to have recorded and have for posterity here in Quincy. So without further ado, I'll give the stage over to Mr. Durden. Thank you, Bobby.
Thank you, Josh. I was asked to speak about the agricultural history in this area. And what I've chosen to do is talk about the three counties that I was most familiar with that Josh just said that I worked in. That was Leon, of course, Gadsden, and Wakulla. I started working extension in '61 in Leon County. And then after that, I went to Wakulla County and left Wakulla County in '79 and came back to Gadsden County, which is my home county. I grew up on a shade tobacco farm here in Gadsden County, out in Coon Bottom. I graduated from Havana High School. I went to ABAC in Tifton, and then the University of Florida. And we're celebrating the 100th anniversary of this research station here in Quincy. And I want to go through and talk a little bit about what led to this station to begin with. And that would be, without shade tobacco, this station probably would not exist today. And I would like to begin by reading a talk that was given on here in Quincy on March the 28th, 1940, given to the Florida Historical Society by Mr. James Love, who was a prominent tobacco grower and business person here in Gadsden County. Mr. Love also, for many years, was on what back in those days was called the Board of Control, chairman of the Florida Board of Control, which really was in charge of the university systems in Florida, like the Board of Regents today. But he was the chairman of that. And if you going down Tennessee Street, Tallahassee, look at one of those buildings at FSU, I think the sign's still there. It says James J. Love Building. Well, that building was named for Mr. Love, who was a tobacco grower, businessman here in Quincy, and he gave this talk in 1940. And I'd like to read parts of it. It says the tobacco history in this county began in the early 1820s, immediately after Florida was ceded to the U.S. Among the settlers coming here at that time was John Smith from Virginia. Since there was already a Smith here by that name, he was called Virginia Smith. This man brought with him from Virginia some tobacco seed. From that date until now, Gadsden County has continuously produced tobacco on a commercial scale, except for interruptions during the latter part of the Civil War and immediately after the war. Several of Virginia Smith's descendants, of which the speaker is one, that was Mr. Love, are still in the area engaged in the production of cigar tobacco in this county. The seed from which he brought with him, probably crossed with native Indian tobacco, quickly took a distinctive type and was known for more than 50 years as Florida Leaf. This was the best known cigar tobacco for many years. This tobacco was marketed largely in Europe, especially in Germany, and was relatively high in price. Various local citizens served as buyers for European countries. Sometimes a crop would be kept a year or two before satisfactory sales was located. From an old buying record in the possession of John Curry, who was from here in Quincy, the buying activities of the late F.M. White was shown for the decades of 1850 and 1860. There are lists of purchases from many familiar names of today, and from which each present-day tobacco farm, such as the Shaw Farm, Love Farm, Davis Farm, etc. Prices range from about 20 to 39 cents per pound, according to this old buying record. However, the Reverend Simon Peter Richardson, Methodist pastor at Quincy in the late 40s, has said the following to say: tobacco culture was at its best, and the product sometimes sold as high as 70 cents per pound. When it was realized that this was a sun-grown tobacco, it can readily see the prices were a lot, because this was sun-grown tobacco. We're told in this period before the Civil War, beginning about 1840, when the South as a whole was suffering from low cotton prices, Gadsden County, with its tobacco business, was the most prosperous county in this section of Florida and South Georgia. This tobacco was exported from St. Mark's, which was then a large port, and also some from Apalachicola. The tobacco was air cured in barns, more or less as today. It was then packed in large cases and held pending the arrival of a buyer. This usually occurred in October and November. Old people have told me in my childhood that tobacco was the only money crop of the pre-war Gadsden County farmer. It took all the cotton and corn and other crops to feed the family and livestock and the slaves. The proceeds from the sale of tobacco, which when it all went well, was saved and used for the purchase of more land. After the Civil War and during Reconstruction days, tobacco almost ceased. This was, of course, due to poverty, readjustment of labor. A few growers grew a little bit during those times, largely for home consumption. About 1885, an official of the FC&F Railroad, which is now Seaboard Airline, which I don't know what it would be now, took some of this tobacco to New York to try to interest some capital in the production. From this trip, several became interested, and representatives of Northern Capital came to our area and reviewed the production of the old and renewed the production of the old Florida Leaf. Most notable of these was the late W.M. Curry, who came in 1887 and is manager of the Owl Commercial Company, which also went by the name of the Owl Cigar Company, purchased several thousand acres of land, and production was again in full swing. In 1898, a new phase of tobacco business began. All through the years, a price that had been paid for the crop that was the lightest in color and silky in texture. It was, of course, desirable that a larger percentage of the crop have these characteristics. Having this fact in mind, the late D.A. Shaw, son of a large pre-war grower, conceived the idea of artificially shading the tobacco. This he accomplished in 1898 with a small structure within the present city limits of Quincy. The shade was merely a wooden frame with nailed slats on top. From this successful experiment his shade tobacco, the shade tobacco industry has spread over this section, the Connecticut Valley, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. The success of shade tobacco was beyond the most optimistic hopes and caused a tremendous boom in this county, which collapsed in the panic of 1908. The shade structure has gradually progressed from a crude wooden structure to the present wire, lath, and cheesecloth that's used. Most improvements were invented by the late John L. McFarland and E.K. Shaw. The sun-grown tobacco continued, and the shade tobacco developed more or less steadily until 1921, when blackshank, most dreaded of all tobacco diseases, threatened to destroy it. A branch of the University of Florida Experiment Station was then placed here in an effort to control the blackshank disease. Dr. William Newell and Dr. W.B. Tinsdale developed a satisfactory resistant type was developed. The experiment station has continued to prove resistant types until today. We're making the best quality tobacco in our history. And as you can of course tell from this, our cigar business has had its full share of ups and downs. Our tobacco is used from Florida to Manila, and approximately 1/3 of all cigars smoked in this country and our possessions is wrapped with Florida shade tobacco. As in the period of 100 years, it is still an outstanding money crop. The farmers of this community handle more money, live better, and on a higher standard than those of any community in the adjoining areas. The cigar tobacco business and sound credit facilities have made this an outstanding general agricultural county for many miles around. That was quotes from the speech. As you can see from this paper, the establishment of the experiment station saved the cigar industry in the industry of this county. In 1921, the legislature appropriated about $30,000, and the growers, farmers, and people of Gadsden County raised the money to purchase approximately 30 acres of land and to build the shade tobacco research station. Soon after this, Dr. Tinsdale, who was a plant pathologist, discovered one healthy tobacco plant and a shade that belonged to the Gregory brothers. And from this one plant, he harvested the seed, and over the next few years, increased the seed supply. And in 1935, he released the RG variety, RG standing for resistant Gregory. This was the first variety that was resistant to blackshank, or the variety that was credited for saving the shade tobacco industry. It's hard for most people today, if you did not grow up here during the shade tobacco era, to realize or understand what shade tobacco did for this area. When I say this area, I mean basically Gadsden County, Decatur County in Georgia, and Grady County, the counties that joined us. That was called the Florida-Georgia shade tobacco area. And shade tobacco was the total economy of the county. Our school system, when I was in school, our school system operated. We got out of school when the tobacco harvest started. We went back earlier than everybody else. And that was basically tobacco. We got out in time to, when they started harvesting a primary tobacco, we were out of school. And so we had a different school schedules than anybody around us, and basically to work in tobacco. But everything, I mean, everything was connected to shade tobacco. When I went, I didn't know there was other crop really. I mean, when I grew up here, and when I used to go to school, when I went to Florida or even other places, every time I'd have to write a paper, I'd write it on shade tobacco, because nobody even at the University of Florida knew anything about shade tobacco. I knew more than the pros, because it was at such a, all of it was centered here. I mean, in this small area. But it was a very, very prosperous and, I guess, good time. There were some bad times, but this was always considered one of the richest agricultural counties in anywhere around during that time. And I'd like to read you a few facts that's kind of interesting relating to shade tobacco. In 1946, it was over 150 million cigars manufactured in Gadsden County. In 1947, the average price was $2.65 a pound. That, at today's prices, that would be $32.44 a pound that the growers received for tobacco in 47. So you hear a lot about people, old people making money from Coca-Cola. There was a lot of money made from tobacco in those times if you were fortunate to be growing that. And we had some 4,000 acres in 47. And so that's a lot of money. But to give you how widespread the growing was, and this figures in 1960. In 1960, we had 21 packers. And I mean, that's people, outfits like General Cigar Company, Tampa Cigar Company, Joe Bud. There was 21 different packing outfits in the county then. And there was 246 individual growers. Now, most people think that shade tobacco growers were relatively large, and some of them were, but there was a lot of 4 and 5 acre guys that grew shade tobacco in those days, because you could take 10 acres of shade tobacco, and if you had a decent year, you could make a living. I mean, I don't know anything else then or now. You could probably grow 10 acres on and make a decent living, but you could in those days on shade tobacco. That's one reason the farm size in Gadsden County is relatively small compared to Jackson, some of us around, because we didn't need big farm. The average farm, I don't know what it was, but probably less than 150 acres back in them days, because everybody, would grow 5, 10, 15 acres of tobacco. But 246 growers. In that year, we had 6,000 acres, 4,700 of it was grown in Gadsden County, 1,300 in our neighbors, great indicator. The average price that year was $2 a pound. The average yield was 1,506 pounds. If you look back in the old records, whatnot, the average yield after the station started, the black shank got rid of, it would run anywhere from 12 to 15 pounds annually, generally at the old record, but 1,506 and 60, that was a good yield. It cost them approximately $2,500 an acre to grow. That was in 1960. In 1965 was the largest acreage of shade tobacco grown in the area, and that was 6,300 acres. That's the most acres we ever grew, and 4,800 of that was in Gadsden County, the rest in South Georgia. The largest crop value in a year was 69. That value was $21,744,000. You put that on today's prices, that's $163 million. That's a pretty large sum of money for one crop in one county, $163 million in 69, I mean. Okay, the only thing that was in 69, in 1978, we had 25 acres of shade tobacco. 1979, we didn't have none. 1978 was the very last thing it was grown. and one guy, Denny Hutchinson, grew 25 acres in. So it went fast when it went. The demise of shade tobacco basically was caused by these factors. One was the development of a homogenized wrapper, which they could take cheap, lower grade tobacco, scrap tobacco, run it through a process, like making paper almost, come out with basically a paper wrapper, and they started putting that on particularly all the cheaper cigars, which a lot of our tobacco went on. Now also regulations on labor, wage and hour came along then. There was a slight less demand for cigars in that time. And you could grow it in the Latin American countries and ship it back into the US cheaper than we could grow it. So, and that's what led to the end of the era in the crop, which was a big blow for this area. That's basically shade tobacco. That's basically what led to this station. And that was the total economy of our county until it went boom there, bust there in 79. But other crops we were growing during the 50s and 60s and all that, most everything indirectly still was tied to shade tobacco. We had a pretty sizable beef cattle industry. We fed, there was about 40,000 head of cattle, beef cattle finished in this county in that year. The reason basically, stable fertilizer and manure from feeding the cattle to put on shade tobacco, because we applied 10 to 15 tons per acre of cattle manure or stable fertilizer per acre on an acre of shade tobacco. And that would, you'd have to feed about 4 steers for 120 days to really get enough manure to fertilize 1 acre. And a lot of these cattle were fed in the tobacco barns in the off season. One farmer would maybe put 100 head of cattle in feed them in the same barns they used for tobacco, and clean it out after they fed them for about 120 days and be ready to put tobacco in the next year. But there was a few people that fed cattle year round and got quite large, feeding them year round. And all that it was tied to the tobacco again. And we also had at that time a packing plant here in Quincy. Frosty Moore Packing Company existed and killed cattle and hogs locally, as well as a lot of them being shipped out. Another crop, and this was tied to about, was pole beans. But over on the east side of the county, everybody, that's where I grew up, and my dad farmed, everybody over there grew pole beans, particularly in the off time, in the fall, after shade tobacco was over. Some was grown in the spring too. But these we grew pole beans, we grew them in the tobacco shades and tied them up just like we did the tobacco. And so, and we had plenty of labor. Tobacco was a labor-intensive crop. You had plenty of labor to pick them, and you were following them with shade tobacco. Didn't take much fertilizer. You had a lot of residual fertilizer. Everybody that grew tobacco had irrigation. And so pole beans was a pretty good crop. And most of the pole beans at that time in our area, that's all, they kind of established a state farmers market here, but most of the pole beans were still bought and shipped by Joe McNair producer at Calvary, Georgia, which is just across the line from Havana. And he shipped, at one time, they were shipping more pole beans than anybody in the South, particularly our kind of pole beans. And that went on, that pole bean production went on a good while after the tobacco was gone. A lot of people continued to grow them for quite a while until most of the shades got in disrepair. We also had a canning plant at that time in Havana called Lico Canning Company. Pole beans were grown for them, different varieties. The Blue Lake variety was grown for Lico, and they canned beans. They also canned other produce. They canned a lot of greens, turnips and stuff. They canned sweet potatoes. They canned a number of crops, boiled peanuts, at that canning plant in Havana. And back during the wartime, they operated, and They received numerous awards and whatnot for their service providing canned goods to the troops during World War II. Another crop that was pretty prevalent at that time, and everybody didn't go, there was a lot of sugar cane grown for syrup. Most everybody grew a little bit for their own use, but there was a number of people that grew considerable acreage. My dad even grew about 60 acres of sugar cane made for syrup. And if any of you that are familiar, I mean, Cairo, Grady County, Cairo's mascot still a syrup makers. Well, when I was in going to school at ABAC, when you left Cairo going to Tifton on 111, you saw nothing by the road from Cairo to Moser but sugar cane. I mean, there was a lot of it grown in this area at that time. And there was even a USDA, federal or USDA sugar cane station up at Meggs. And it was bought primarily by Rottenberry in Cairo because they made pickles and did a lot of other stuff. And they reprocessed the syrup and bottled it and sent it to the grocery stores too. But all that went out in the 60s. Some other crops that we were trying along there at the same time, tried peaches for a while around here, and we had peaches, several hundred acres of peaches, but that didn't last too long. And one thing I'd like to mention that I had that's kind of different is mules. During the shady back of time, we had more mules in Gadsden County than probably anywhere in the Southeast. They say, now I don't know, but I know the reason being, once you tied the shady back up in the shade, you could not get a tractor or any kind of mechanical equipment in it. So all the cultivating and whatnot was done by mules. So a lot of the large farms around here had 15, 20 mules, and everybody else had one or two. I remember we always had 2 mules for years, but that was just because we was a shade tobacco production. Okay, a few things I'd like to mention after the shade tobacco era was over, and some of these crops that I just mentioned that we grew a lot around here. We tried to come up with something to replace shade tobacco, and the farmers did. Well, in the 70s, we thought tomatoes might be, which was, as you know, tomatoes is a high value crop. So tomato season in the spring is about like the tobacco season. You plant them the same time. It's labor intensive. You need irrigation. You need all these things. Well, we had all that, and we thought we had labor, but that we found out pretty quick. Local labor did not fit tomato harvester production, and that's when very shortly we had the migrant labor, because local labor did not work out in tomato fields here. When I don't know, back then, when I first came over back here in the 70s and whatnot, we had some tin to make it different packing houses in packing tomatoes. And we were going, according to what Josh says, probably acreage is not much difference now than then. I thought it was probably a little lower now. But we grew several thousand acres in the spring, several thousand acres, or 1,500 or so in the fall each year. So we were going, 4,000 to 5,000 acres in both seasons. But tomatoes never came close to tobacco. Of course, it's a much riskier crop. NAFTA came along, and we can't compete with Mexico and the other countries. And and there was not, and you remember I mentioned we had 250 something tobacco growers. We never came close to having it. We probably never had more than 20 tomato growers in the county. Another thing that has been successful for some replacing tobacco is the woody ornamentals or the nursery folks. Okay, in the early or late 50s, the largest tobacco outfit here called AST Tobacco Company was a New York corporately owned outfit, but they had thousands of acres and a bunch of farms. But all of a sudden, they quit growing tobacco here in about 1956 or so. So in 1960, one of their farms, which they turned into Imperial Nursery, which was a very large nursery here in Gadsden County, that it's closed today, but AST Company had a nursery operation also in Connecticut where they were headquartered. And so they went into the nursery business. And they were in for a good long time here, very successful. And that led to some other folks, which I will, at one time, and there was quite a few smaller nurseries, but a lot of them are gone and they didn't last too long. But some of the ones that did make the transition, one of the most successful was May Nursery. This building is named after Mr. Fount May. Well, the Mays had made a tobacco company, and when the tobacco was going out, they started in the nursery business. Kind of small to begin with, and as you know today, if you go to Havana, it's a pretty large operation. It's been a very successful deal, and that was a transition. Then also Mr. Shelfer, Wallace Shelfer, which is right across the road from May Nursery. He went in the nursery business a little bit later and built quite a nursery. And that's the same nursery that today is owned by Clinton Nursery. And then Fletcher's at Greensboro started the nursery, which was pretty successful. That is the same, now that is Hackney Nursery. But those three operations really are quite successful and large today, employ a lot of people, ship a lot of plants. It's probably one of the more valuable enterprises in Gadsden County from an agricultural standpoint. They were all old tobacco farmers that went into the nursery business. Some other crops we still do some of here in that time. Sod production, we have a number of people who went into sod production after the tomato business. Field crops, we have some field crops, but Gadsden County has never been a big county growing cotton, soybeans, and corn. I mean, we always grew some, but not, say, compared to Jackson or whatnot. And I guess basically, farmers in this area at the time, they were used to high dollar crops. They didn't like to grow $100 acre crops. They wanted $1,000 acre crops. Of course, our farm size was relatively small, as I said earlier, which you got to have large acres to be successful with cotton, soybeans, and those crops. We grew some, but they were never a major enterprise compared to tobacco. Some people at that time it was pretty big business in the area at times, swine production. And we did have in the 60s, we probably had 12, 15 people that had 100 plus sow operations. We had one that was quite large, had over 500 sows, whatnot, and produced hogs during that area. But like everything else, over time, I don't think we got any now except a few backyards that the hog production went out. Okay, in my time or up to now, well, even before now, that's kind of the history of the Gadsden County part of agriculture that I'm the most familiar with. And but I would like to mention, I worked in Leon County, but to give you a little information on Leon County, in the 60s, when I started in 61, there were 17 dairies in Leon County. Far to my knowledge, I don't know if there's any today, but there were 17 dairies and some quite large dairies. Velda Dairy, which you see Velda Dairy Road, that was a large operation. They milked several thousand cows. But there was a lot of dairies, in Leon County at that time. Even FSU had one, FAMU had one, the federal prison had one, and then all these others there. So it was, the dairy was probably the larger agricultural enterprise at that time in Leon County. Beef cattle, good many beef cattle in Leon County in those days. A lot of the plantations, which still exist today out there, of course, the plantations basically are large areas used mostly for hunting then and now. But back in those days, they had quite a few cattle, some of them on those plantations. They always grew corn and other grain crops, but most of what they grew was basically to feed the birds, primarily quail. And that's still true today, as far as I know, on the still quite a few acres over there in plantations. You would have thought there'd have been a big nursery and sod production deal at that time in Tallahassee, but Tallahassee was a lot different then. There was some nurseries, most of them were rather small. There was a few people in the sod business, but they were pretty small. And that basically was the major agricultural enterprises, you know, in Leon County at that time. Now in Wakulla County, as most of you know, Wakulla County is sandy soil, not real productive agriculturally, but in the 70s, we did grow some 2,500 acres or so peanuts in Wakulla County. And part of those peanuts were grown for Rottenberry and Cairo again, because they can boil peanuts, and they like boiled green peanuts from Wakulla County because they were grown in very sandy land. And when they were harvested, picked green, they were relatively clean. When they went to boil them, they didn't have to worry about having to wash them up too much and all that. They were relatively clean when they got them. And so that was probably row crop was the most that was going on down there. There was swine production in that area, a lot of small swine producers down there at that time. And extension and whatnot in Florida, then we had started what we call the Florida graded feeder pig sales, which these sales were held almost monthly somewhere in the area. They used to be held in Quincy, Madison, Live Oak, Lake City, in this area, where they'd have a monthly graded feeder pig sale, where people carried their pigs, and I'm under 50 pounds, and they were graded by some of us, agent or swine specialists, whatnot, and grouped and sold that way. And for small producers, it was pretty good deal, and it was pretty successful for quite a while. Most of the pigs, believe it or not, was sold to garbage feeders in South Florida. At that time, there was in the restaurant business and tourist business and in South Florida, some people were hooked up and picked up the swill from the nurseries, whatnot, restaurants, and they bought a lot of pigs from up here and carried them back down and fed them. They'd feed them garbage most of the time. The last 30 days or so, they'd switch and put them on corn. And when they sold them, if you didn't know that, you didn't know the difference. It was a pretty good deal at the time. I don't even know where they let them do that now. I don't think so. They had to cook it. They did have to cook it even then, but they've had a deal where they cooked it on trucks. And one particular deal, his operation was an old air base, and he cooked it on a truck, like a cement truck you'd look like. And when it was cooked, he drove out across the cement pad and dumped it. And the hogs fed on it until they were near slaughter weight, and then they switched them to corn for a while, and then they sold them. Honey production in Wakulla County, honey production was pretty good. Then we had about 30 commercial beekeepers in Wakulla County. And that ranged, most of these guys had from a couple of hundred hives to as many as 2,500 hives, which they were after. The main honey crop was Tupelo, which Tupelo honey is still not much, very high today and very scarce. It's from the Tupelo trees that bloom along the Apalachicola River. Other river bottoms in this area has Tupelo, and that was a premium product. And there was quite a few people in the for Wakulla County in the honey business at that time, and did pretty well. The Sea Grant program started then, which that's where IFAS and Extension started providing some help to the fishermen and crab folks on the coast and whatnot. We had a Sea Grant agent that served Wakulla and Franklin and Gulf counties at the time, and did work with the crab trappers and whatnot. Still a successful program today, but it started in the 70s there. One other thing about most people don't realize about Wakulla County, then and still true today, there's not much private land in Wakulla County. Wakulla County then was 60% owned by the national government. That's the Apalachicola National Forest and St. Martin's Wildlife Refuge. 25% of it then was owned by St. Joe Paper Company. That's probably changed some today, but then that only left 15% of the land area of Wakulla County in private ownership for somebody to do what they farm or do whatever they wanted to, relatively small. Of course, then when I was down there, when I first went down there, probably, I think maybe 10,000 people. And since then, it's been one of the fastest growing counties. I don't know what the population is today. Probably twice 10,000, I'm sure. The North Florida Research and Education Center has been a great asset to this area and agriculture for the last 100 years. Hopefully, the future will lead to the same, and much progress can be made by agriculture in the next 100 years as we made in the last 100 years from this station. I thank y'all.
She is going to moderate any questions. I don't know if she can hear me.
Yes, thanks, Josh. Thanks, Mr. Durden. If there's any questions from the audience, I do not have any in the chat so far, but if there are any questions and you would rather speak up, go ahead and unmute, and I request that you change your view mode to gallery. If that's difficult and complicated, don't worry about it. Just unmute and ask your question anyway. Mr. Durden, while there are questions coming up, can I ask you a question? So back in the time, how did a typical day in an extension agent's life look? What does a typical day comprise?
I didn't quite understand you.
A day in the life of an extension agent.
A day in the life of an extension agent then? Well, I will say one thing. And I was taught this by my first job when I went to Leon County. My boss was Lloyd Roden, who was county agent then at that time. And Lloyd Roden did not want you in the office. He said if you were in the office, you was wasting time. If you had nothing to do, he'd encourage you, you get out and ride around. And when you see somebody side of the road, you stop and talk to them. You go visit. You go let people know who you are. And we did a, I think compared to today, and I don't want to be critical of anybody, but in the early days, of course, we didn't have the communication system you do today. We didn't have computers, and we didn't have cell phones, which thank God, I thank for that. But we didn't have those techniques. So we were out. I'd say somebody like me was probably out 75% of the time because I took what Mr. Roden said to heart. If I wasn't too busy, I just got in my car and went. Right around, you see somebody, you go visit, people you knew and had growing crops or whatnot. You did a lot more visiting. When we got calls in, even from homeowners, generally we would not. Sometimes you'd try to answer them over the phone, but most of the time you'd say, okay, I'll come by there tomorrow afternoon. I'm going out the sofa. I'll stop and look at this azalea bush, or I'll stop and look at this tomato plant, which was probably already dead. But we did we did a lot of that. And I think, in my opinion, of course, I'm an old timer, the personal contact we had in those days in this area, everybody knew who the county agent was. Everybody. Now, sometimes that wasn't always good, but they knew who you were. And you went to everything. You were expected to go to be in the civic clubs. You were expected to go to the church suppers. You were expected to do all this stuff. And so you had a lot of personal contact. And generally you were well respected in the area you were in. And I still think that's a good time of extension because you had the personal contact. Even then, you know, our state specialists, when we called on them, most of the time we'd have meetings, of course, like now, but you'd plan it where the specialists, if you were visiting tomato growers and this was an outside guy from Gainesville was coming up, well, he'd come up and we'd ride around and visit growers all this afternoon, have the meeting tonight. A lot of that type of stuff. And I think the main difference was, now we did, in the small counties, particularly Wakulla County, when I went there, I was the first agent that went to Wakulla County that did not vaccinate hogs for cholera. In fact, some of you have heard this in the early days, in the 40s and 50s, and even into the 60s, the counties that did not have veterinarians, the small counties like Wakulla, Liberty, Gulf, some of those, one of the jobs the agent had is you vaccinated the hogs in the county for cholera. So they kind of looked at you as a vet. And I was the first one that went to Wakulla. They didn't do that. And that was a hard thing to quit because, man, you'd have people calling you on the weekends and everything else. And when I first went there, you'd have to leave over the weekend so you wouldn't be bothered. But you know, it was good and it was bad. But they did, in those areas, in those times, when they called you, they expected you to show up, not send them a note or return the phone call. They wanted to see you. But I will admit one thing, it was good. I can tell you a funny story that about then, and when I was in Wakulla County. Of course, Wakulla County is a great hunting and fishing county, particularly then. And I love to hunt. And one day, my district agent was at the office in Crawfordville, and I was doing my evaluation thing. And of course, the secretary had the door closed and all that. Well, this man came down and said, I need to see Bobby. And she said, well, he's tied up. And she told me, he said, well, I'm just going to open the door a minute and tell him something. And he opened the door and said, Bobby, you need to come out to my house this afternoon about 1 o'clock. And he said, oh, and don't forget to bring your shotgun. And I said, thank you, sir. And then when he left, the district agent asked me, what does he mean bring your shotgun? I said, well, we shoot doves down here every Wednesday afternoon. And so but it was, you know, that guy was a county commissioner, so I didn't have to worry about the county. I'd have been in more hot water, I think, if I hadn't went and shot dove. But I wasn't worried too much about Gainesville at the time. But that, I think the main difference now and then is it was more personal contact and hands-on, and now it's more with the latest technology over the phone and computer and all that, you know. And I had a hard time, even when I retired, 79, when we all first started computers. Well, I didn't take one because he came by and offered me one, said, I'm not going to learn to use it, so give it to somebody that will. But, and I did. And I always did hate for somebody in my office to say, well, if you look it up on so, you can get it on the computer, so-and-so. I didn't like that answer. I mean, most people know that, but I wanted them to say, hey, okay, I'll come out and check on it, or I'll get you some info or something like that. And I think we've lost a lot of personal contact. I believe that. And I think that has hurt Extension and some of our other programs that we, compared to public support, that we used to have more grassroots support maybe than we do today.
Bobby, I've got a question. What was run us through the kind of timeline of shade tobacco starting in the spring, going to harvest? Like what would you, when did you start seed beds? When the transplants go in? When did you start harvest?
On the, on what crop? Any of them?
Shade tobacco.
Oh, shade tobacco. Okay, shade tobacco. Okay, it's kind of a timeline on that. Everybody grew their own plants of shade tobacco too. So usually in the winter time, there was a lot of jobs that you had cheesecloth and other things to put up, but you plant your plant bed generally early. So you prepared your plant bed starting in December, January, and whatnot, and would plant the seed in the plant bed just as soon as you thought the cold weather was over, you know, and then in about, say March, you would start, you'd put plants in the field, and then tobacco, like other crop, was a very fast growing crop. So after about, probably a month or so, give or take, you would tie it up. And then another thing we did in shade tobacco, once it was tied up, and I say tied up, I mean, when a string was put around the plant and tied to the wire above it, shade, you'd go through and wrap it as it grew. And you wrapped it because a wind would blow it over, and you didn't want the rows to get tangled up with leaves, because on shade tobacco, you did not want a hole or a break in the leaf at all if possible. I mean, any break or little hole or anything lowered the value of that leaf. So even when you had a windstorm and it flipped the leaves over and all that, you would go through, if it was good bit, and just turn the leaves back to like they were. But anyway, you do go through that, and probably about the very end of May, 1st of June, you start harvest. And harvest would take you probably, 6 weeks. If you started, say, the 1st of May, not the 1st of May, but the 1st of June, you generally be, a lot of years you're through harvest by July the 4th, middle of July anyway. And of course, that would be the harvest. By that time, you'd have it all out of the field and in the barn. And then once it was in the barn, it might be in the barn, depending, 4 or 6 weeks or something, and then it went to the packing house. But when I said earlier, the cropping system, if you look back when we went from shade tobacco to tomato, in the spring crop, very similar. They were planted put out about the same time, tied up, same process more or less, same growing sequence. And so that's how we kind of transitioned pretty good from tobacco to tomatoes, because and growers here compared to field crop counties, like I say, we were used to high dollar crops. And they didn't get scared when you said it was going to cost you $5,000 to do this. I mean, some row crop guys, $5,000, man, I can't do that. That's more than I'm probably going to make. So there's a lot of difference in the mentality of the farmers in the area. I mean, it's what they were used to and what they did.
And all that tobacco was suckered, wasn't it? Did you have to sucker all that?
Well, okay. All of it was most of it was suckered, but we generally never topped it. We'd break the side suckers off, but most of the time, now some people did, but most generally, it would grow out the top of the shade, and when it bloomed, the blooms would be out of what's shade about 9 foot tall. So some of those plants would be 10 foot tall, blooming, but it was tied up. It was cultivated in the early stages a number of times, good, bad, or otherwise. I don't, back in the early days, people felt more about cultivation than we do today. I can remember people growing corn when I was a kid. Man, they'd plow that corn when it was waist high, tearing up all kind of roots, but that was what you did at the time. But it was that, you did that to it. Of course, it was the pesticides. And in my time, all the pesticides basically was applied by airplane generally on most everything. We used dust generally, and it was put out by airplane. Maybe some special deals you might, in the early stage, do it by hand or hand equipment, blow gun or something, but most of it was by airplane. And it you know, that was kind of the time sequence. But I mean, even though it was a very fast crop, and saying 120 days from the time you set it out was probably all out of the field, but there was a lot of preparation, the shades, the cheesecloth put up, all this stuff. All that stuff generally started, well, if it didn't start before, as soon as Christmas was over, it started. I mean, you'd have to put in new posts, you'd have to put the cheesecloth up, you'd have to do all that things. And I do remember this, because you would have things like hail, stuff like this that would tear up cheesecloth. I can remember this because I was at ABAC, but in 1958, a lot of people in my family included had cheesecloth put up, and already up in, it was in February, some early February, I don't remember the exact date, but we've had the biggest snow then that I think we've had in this area really till the day, but it snowed several inches. And if you had the good cheesecloth up, it wouldn't tear. It helped that snow up there till it got so heavy, it broke the white, it broke post off around the outside, it broke the anchors, it put shades flat on the ground. It was a mess. Much harder to clean up and get back up than if it hadn't happened. Hail was the same way sometimes. I've seen some shades really messed up with hail that caught up. If it didn't tear it up, you were better off if it tore it up, because if it all accumulated on top and got so heavy it broke shades down, you really had a mess. But that was some of the hazards of it. Fire, cheesecloth would burn. I mean, every once in a while in the areas here, lightning hitting this shade or something, burn it off. I saw one that way, and they covered it back up, and the crop was about halfway there. It seemed that, I don't think it basically, luckily, hurt the plants too much, but it burned the top off, burned the strings loose, and you know, it was set. But that was some of the hazards that you had with shade tobacco. Now, and another thing about shade tobacco, I mean, everybody who grew shade tobacco wasn't rich, because they was, like I say, there's 254 growers or so in the county for quite a few years. I have the Florida Georgia Tobacco Leaf Association records that have the acres, packers, growers, and all that. And so I think it's probably the best, most accurate records of how many people grew and the total acreage that we have. And I never, as a kid, I never had in my mind that about 300 people were growing this. I mean, I knew everybody in my area did, and yes, but that's a lot of people. We hadn't had a crop before or since where that many people were involved in production, not adding the people in the packing houses and this kind of thing.
Thank you, Mr. Durden. There were a few comments that were left in the chat here out in Zoom land. I want you to know that there were, about 40 people who were watching this presentation from across the state, mostly from Gainesville and Mariana, and of course from Quincy and Live Oak. We had one comment that our Associate Dean for Extension, Dr. Mukhtar, left in the chat window. He said, Mr. Durden, making personal contacts with clients and stakeholders was valuable then, and it is valuable today. So the personal contact is still very important. That was a comment that was left in the chat for you, Mr. Durden. With that, thank you once again. And Josh, if you have any final comments, otherwise we can conclude this meeting.
I think that's it. Just want to thank you for taking your time to do it, Bobby.
I hope it's what you want.
Oh,